So yes, just let me know when you want to get started.
Okay. I think we are good to go, Tanya. If you want to take the floor and get us going, we have 15 people on the call, so it's a lot of our participants. I love good percentage of what we had registered.
Well, great. So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you all so much for being on this wonderful webinar that is going to occur today. This is for our National Call to Action Technical Assistance Project, with really sort of a theme of collective empowerment, collective liberation. The National Call to Action, or NCTAP project, has been in existence since 2011, or 2010, I believe it was, where we were awarded this grant under the Office on Violence Against Women shortly after holding our National Call to Action conference, where we centralized the voices, the wellness, and the leadership of women of color. And so this project has allowed us to work with state coalitions to really help centralize and assist them in centralizing the voices of women of color, and to really increase their opportunities and accesses in serving and working with marginalized communities and communities of color. And so just really pleased to be having this webinar today. And I just kind of joined on because I saw that this was happening, and I thought that I was going to be doing something else, and I thought I'd take a moment to sort of, it's almost like a swing in to just say hello, because, you know, Jolene Joseph is one of my very favorite people, but these days my schedule is so busy, and I know that she's working very hard on the NCTAP project, that I don't get an opportunity to connect with Jolene much. So I just really didn't. So it was a selfish opportunity for me to jump in and say, hey, Jolene, and to jump in and say, I'm so excited that you're doing this. This is so timely right now to be talking about tribal communities, to really be looking at this concept of decolonization, and to really sort of lend this voice, this all-important voice and perspective to the landscape that's occurring right now nationally and internationally. And I know, Jolene, your travels have taken you all around the world to work with Indigenous populations, and to bring those voices together, to weave that thread, that common thread of voice among sovereign nations and Indigenous peoples all around the world. So I know that you stand on many shoulders of many elders and many communities and many legacies, to have this conversation with folks today. And so I'm excited for that. I know that you have I believe you said that you have a slide, Virginia, on our mission, or do you want me to just sort of speak to that?
Can you speak to that?
Sure.
Thank
Yes.
you.
And so Women of Color Network is a national nonprofit. We have been in existence since 1997 as, um, and I believe there's some background noise.
Yes.
And then, okay, great. And um, so we were previously a project of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is one of the groups that have been involved with the NCTAP project. And we spun off in 2014 to become an independent nonprofit. We've been independent now for 4 years and really stand on solid ground, working around the country. We've got staff. We have 10 staff. It seems like every time I talk, I hear noise, so I don't know what you're doing. Okay. Virginia, is there something I can't hear you? Okay, so I've unmuted myself, so I'll continue, and you all can hear me then. Okay, great, great, great. So, so we have 10 staff in 6 different states. We really took the plunge to stand firm on this idea of women of color leadership, and this organization now that we hold together as women of color and aspiring allies that are holding this group, and our amazing strong, powerful team of consultants all around the country really help us to sort of lead and to continue this work on a national and hopefully, you know, continuing on an international level. And so, you know, I think NCTAP exemplifies this idea of women of color really being in leadership. And so the mission of the Women of Color Network is to eliminate violence against all women by centralizing the voices, the wellness, and the leadership of women of color across the sovereign nations. And it was very important for us to have sovereign nations listed to really ensure that we centralized within communities of color, to really centralize tribal nations, so to really look at sovereign nations, the United States and the U.S. territories. And so that's the approach that we take in the work. And so we, as our consultants, our staff, we are representative of folks from Asian, African, Latin, Native, Middle Eastern, bi- and multiracial descent. And so we are a multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multiracial group that really works to support and build multicultural alliances across all of our communities. And so this is the approach in the work that we do. So without taking up much more time, I just want to thank you all again for joining on. And just again, and I have to say, I can only be on for a little while. So I'm actually grateful to sort of swing in and to be a part of the conversation. So I'll be on for a little while longer. I just wanted to tell you all are in for such a treat to hear from Jolene today, and to receive the powerful information that I know that she'll share that will really work across some of the purpose areas that Women of Color Network really looks at. It's important to us to link issues across racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, and all forms of oppression, and to really look at ways that issues around human trafficking, police brutality, over-incarceration, and really in this case to really look at some of the balance that tribal communities have to engage in on a daily basis around sovereignty and government-to-government relationships when you have broken treaties and other things that exist. And so it's very very important to take in what you received today. And without further ado, I will pass it back to Virginia. I don't know if you have other things that you need to say in getting the the webinar going, and excited to see and to hear Jilene take us in a wonderful direction today. So thank you. Brahini, I think you're still on mute, hon.
I was trying to avoid noise. So thank you so much, Tanya, for that introduction. I don't have anything because I was going to read the bio of Miss Joseph, and that's not as fun as the way you described it. So Jilene, take the floor, please, and lead us through the webinar. If you can unmute yourself, if not, I can also do that. Jilene, can you unmute yourself? Sorry about that.
I think you might have to unmute her.
Yeah, I have to unmute everyone. I believe I can't figure out how to unmute only her. Give me just a moment, okay? There you go.
What you might need to do is unmute Jilene. Unmute everyone and then mute everybody back except for Jilene. I'm saying one by one.
For some reason, I cannot do that. I am so sorry about that.
Jilene, if you look on your screen at the far bottom left-hand corner, you should have a microphone that you can unmute, that you can click and it will unmute you.
On the bottom of the Zoom screen, Jilene. Okay. I think I got it.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Now if everyone can mute yourself because we don't want any background. Go ahead, and I apologize about that difficulty.
Okay, no, it was my fault. All the pictures that you see on the screen, I clicked on a button and it hid mine, so I couldn't unmute myself because I don't see myself.
I see. Okay. Sorry about that.
I don't know where I went. Anyway, thank you. So good to see you, Tanya, and thank you for being on, even if it's just for a few minutes. It's awesome to see your beautiful face. And thank you, everyone, for being on here. So my name is Jilene Joseph, and I am the executive director of also a national nonprofit organization called the Native Wellness Institute. And we have been in existence since 2000. And we exist because of colonization, really. We exist as an organization we work with Indian tribes and organizations across the nation. And as Tanya alluded to, we also do work up in Canada, and we've done work in Australia and New Zealand as well with the Indigenous people there. And so we exist as an agency because of the impacts of historical and intergenerational trauma. And more importantly, we exist to help bring that awareness and help to bring opportunities for healing to help people move forward. Because simply put, healing is the answer to trauma. So that is my soapbox, I guess you could say, and has been for my entire professional working life. So a little bit about me before we jump into the webinar. Like I said, I'm the executive director of the Native Wellness Institute. We were founded in 2000. I'm one of the founding members, and I became the executive director in 2005. I've been doing this kind of work in tribal communities since I was 19, and I am now 52. So for over half of my life, have traveled to hundreds of tribal communities across North America and working with our people. And I have 5 children. My baby's 17 and just graduated from high school. I have a 20-year-old, and I have a 23-year-old and a 25-year-old and a nephew that I raised who's 32, who he also has, him and his wife have made me a grandmother, so I'm a grandmother. My daughter, Shailene, just graduated with her master's degree, so we had 2 graduations in 1 week. It was this really amazing week. I like to read, and I like to bead, and I like to visit with friends and family, and my passion really is this work in helping our people to heal. And I really think that when I first came involved with the Women of Color Network, that was one of the strong messages that I brought to this work, is that healing is the answer to trauma. And when I first became involved with the domestic violence movement, what I found was that the movement was filled with violence, and on different levels. And lateral oppression, for example, some people will call lateral violence. And anyway, I just saw a lot of violence. And so what I see, not just in this movement, but other movements, is the elevation of trauma and people understanding trauma, which then naturally elevates the conversation about healing. And so just hearing that word, you know, I'm always big on language and the words that we use. And so even that word healing is being used a lot more, even in the past 5 years, than I have seen in the past. And so that's really good, because healing is the answer to trauma. You'll probably hear me say that over and over. So to really understand violence and a bunch of the other isms, we really have to understand the impacts of colonization before we can better understand decolonization and what that means. And so in this presentation, you know, that's what we're going to be taking a look at. So when we look at this first slide, and we look at in a world of isms, these are just some questions for us to think about for ourselves. You know, what do I stand for? Who do I stand with? Do I stand for racial justice, the end of discrimination, racial violence, and a society truly based on equal opportunity? Do I stand with tribal people, people of color, and white allies in the struggle to uproot isms? And then to better understand decolonization, we first have to understand colonization. So interestingly, you know, I did this PowerPoint a while ago, but a few days ago, our president pardoned a couple of men, two brothers actually, that were involved in the takeover of that Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Some of you may have heard about it or remember it. It was a couple of years ago in Oregon, the state. I live in Oregon. The people that I come from are from Montana, but I live in Oregon now. But anyway, a couple of years ago, basically these ranchers took over the Malheur Wildlife National Refuge. And they did so based kind of on their rebel attitudes about the government having ownership over land, and they wanted to graze their cattle. And it's a much larger story. But anyway, they took over, like for a month at gunpoint, they took over this wildlife refuge. And there was a local tribe there in the same town, the Burns Paiute tribe, that had an agreement with the refuge to keep some of their sacred items. They had grave sites out there that the people that took it over, like, desecrated these graves, desecrated the items that were there, and all these other horrible things. Anyway, they went to trial, they got off. A couple of them had some charges from other things. Anyway, President Trump pardoned them. And meanwhile, last week, you probably also heard about the Standing Rock, encampment and all that kind of stuff that happened last year. And all these water protectors are still in court, like going to court. And last week, one of the women who was standing up to protect our earth, whereas here the Bundys and the Hammonds and all these other men were desecrating the earth, over here the water protectors, she just got sentenced to, I think it was 57 months in prison for standing up for the environment. So I'm just using this example as in the world of isms that we live in, right? And who are we standing with, and what do we stand for in doing this work? Because when we look at the desecration of the land and the attitudes that contribute to that, it directly correlates to the violence on our earth directly correlates to violence on women. And so we have to understand these ways of thinking, because it goes way back, right? It goes way back to the founding. If you can see me, my hands are in quotations, the founding of this country. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So when we talk about isms, then the first one really that we have to embrace and understand is colonialism, because that then helps us better understand all of the things that we see happening today. So there's a friend of mine and colleague, his name is Dr. Michael Yellowbird, and he studies this, and this is his thing that he teaches. He's a teacher of Native American studies, and he's currently working in North Dakota, but he's worked in different universities around the country. But these are his definitions of colonialism. So a system in which one people claim sovereignty over another and assert social, political, economical, and spiritual domination over the colonized. And so the picture that you see in here is I just lost it. You know, what do they call it when, I just forgot what it's called. When you get, when a church, sorry, I totally just lost the word. Anyway, when a church like welcomes you in as a member, it's called something, but I can't think of what that word is. Anyway, that's basically what this.
Jolene, someone just typed in and said, do you mean baptize?
Oh yes, baptize.
Yeah. So thank you, Yi.
The word just totally lost my, and anyway, so that's what this picture is, right? It's also, it's how Christianity was a part of colonization as well, and what that did to our people. And if you looked at a map of the United States, different people had first contact and first efforts of colonization in this country. So for example, you know, in Alaska, for example, Alaska was first influenced by Russia. And so many of the indigenous people living in Alaska have Russian religious values and Russian belief systems, and even some of their holidays are different and things like that than regular Christian holidays in the lower 48. Or in the Southwest, for example, you know, different people colonized that area, so they were influenced by different churches and religions and things like that. So that's a part of colonialism, and understanding, you know, where we're at in the country and kind of what branch of Christianity latched onto those areas. So for example, it was Mormons in some areas, and so some areas of the United States, Mormons had a huge influence, or the Catholics had a huge influence, et cetera, et cetera. So colonialism is also motivated by beliefs and values that the colonizer is superior to the colonized. And that's basically what racism is, right? Is white superiority. And then the other thing that happens is that colonialism really isn't a mainstream topic. It's mainstream when we look at higher education in terms of academics, like that's studied a lot. But in mainstream society, it's really not, you know, talked about. So I'm super happy that this webinar is happening here. So we can take a look at some early pictures, like these were posters and things like that that were when America was being founded and the West was being won. Again, my hands are on quotes here, and these different pictures like this popped up. And the difference here, you know, the chosen race, right? So these are the European settlers coming over as the chosen race, and we were deemed as the defiled race. And that's important to understand, because not only was it the attitude then, but it most often continues to be the attitude today. And not just with tribal people, but with other people that aren't white. And you'll see here in a minute. Okay, so these labels, the defiled race, and then we take a look at, what is in a label. So the settlers labeled us as savage. And that is we are referred to as merciless Indian savages in the United States Declaration of Independence. And so it's interesting that, July 4th just happened, where we're celebrating our independence. And I found it interesting that, when I see different posts on social media and people are even getting mixed up, like what July 4th is all about. July 4th is about celebrating the independence of this country, right? And then, like I said, in there, we're referred to as merciless Indian savages. And that's important because much of those attitudes from 1776, still trickle down to today. And so labeling us as savage then, way back when, made it okay for dehumanization. And so acts to dehumanize us then were a part of colonization. So we're just kind of like just connecting all of these dots. And a lot of times the dehumanization continues. So, and it's the dehumanization of not just tribal people, but after that, the African-American people that were brought here in slavery, people south of the border when they came here, like we see that play out even in today, right? So that's why this is so important to understand, like, where all this comes from. So in terms of the Indigenous experience here then, settler colonialism dehumanized the Indigenous people in many different ways, by massacres, biological warfare, and chemical warfare. So massacres is pretty straightforward, right? People being killed. And I'm always reminded of this story. I was doing we've done a lot of work with the Wampanoag people up in Martha's Vineyard. And when you go to their community, they take you to these big cliffs where the clay and I don't know, all the different kind of dirt and stuff that's in there, it's like, it changes color, but it's very bright. And sometimes it's white and it's kind of like these striated colors. But way back when, before we had lighthouses, those cliffs were the natural lighthouses. And so many of the first ships coming, that's where they came. So they talk about their ancestors standing on those cliffs, watching these ships come, and then their ancestors lived by their value systems, and they welcomed the people off of these ships, and they fed the people off of these ships, they clothed them, they housed them, they taught them how to live on this new land. And in their stories, they talk about that process taking like 7 years for the people from these ships to get their foothold, and then to turn around and to basically tell the tribal people, do what we tell you, do what we say, or we'll kill you. And they basically massacred, and then their story and their histories that, the women and children and elders. And so that's an example of a massacre. And then that continued, right? And then as time went on and like all these massacres happened, but we were still here, right? And so they're like, okay, now we got to like change our strategy here. How are we going to deal with these people? So then biological warfare was one of the ways that we were dehumanized, where smallpox, for example, we were given smallpox infested blankets and clothing to wear as biological warfare to kill us. I have stories in my tribe that talks about this, and more importantly, our stories are about what we did to protect ourselves from the smallpox. And so it's just really interesting, these stories that we have. And then after biological warfare came the chemical warfare. And what that means is through alcohol, our people were given alcohol that we didn't have alcohol in our history. We didn't have alcohol in our current societies when the settlers came. And so chemical warfare then was another attempt at dehumanization. So we were given alcohol and then asked to, sign treaties, signing away all of our land, or, all these different kinds of things. So alcohol played a huge role and continues to be a substance that devastates our people, even though our stereotype, I guess, or the opinion that people have about us is the drunken Indian. And that's because of how devastating alcohol impacted our people. But since the 1970s, we actually have more people that don't drink alcohol per population than any other population in the United States. But hardly anybody knows that because of how powerful stereotypes are, right? So I just wanted to share that too. So we've embraced how bad alcohol has devastated our people, and we've worked really, really hard to turn that around. So, and then we continue on with the dehumanization. And I know this is a lot, just like take a deep breath. But again, it's important to understand all these concepts. So when the massacres and biological warfare and chemical warfare didn't work, the dehumanization continued. So then it went after our children. And so Native children were taken, sometimes literally stolen from families, and moved sometimes hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away into boarding schools. And these boarding schools were either run by the government or they were run by Christian churches. And there was a particular General Pratt, who was in the Army, that was overseeing all of the government-run boarding schools. And his theme was kill the Indian, save the man. And so this is where policies like you couldn't speak your language, you couldn't dress like you usually dressed, you couldn't do any of the practices, you couldn't live by your values, basically. And this had a huge impact on our people, because if you think about being removed from not only your parents, but your communities where you were socialized, where you learned how to, be a human being, basically, and you were taken into a system that was very punitive, like this had a huge and continues to have a huge devastation on our people. So this is an example of the pictures that you see here are the same person. So the person that you see on the left is pre-boarding school, and then the person on the right is post-boarding school. So they were trying to kill the culture, basically, to be a good human being, basically, is what that's saying. So settler colonialism, there's I'm not going to read the thing. You can read the slide what that is. But what I want to say about this is, in academia and higher education across this country, there's many universities that have degrees in American Indian Studies or Native American Studies or Indigenous Studies. They call it different things. But in that pocket, they refer to white people as settlers. And it's always interesting, like when I do this kind of work and I ask white people, well, what do you want to be called, or what do you call yourselves? And some of us will say, some of us call white people, but in other pockets of the country, people refer to them as settlers, right? Because really that's what white people are in this country. They're settlers, European settlers. So we can take a look, we can read these slides and take a look at what is settler colonialism. And again, this is important to understand and talk about this, and then to really reflect on how that continues, how settler colonialism still plays out today, right? And even while Tani's still on here, and I know she knows this already, and I say this a lot, like the funding that's even funding this webinar, if we go into that, like, to me, that's like the federal government that provides the funding to do all this good work that we're doing is like oppressive. And the thing, and all of you that get OVW funding know what I'm talking about. You know, we have to get approval for everything that we do and say, and you know, it's oppressive. I could go on and on about that, but I know our webinar is not about that. So we look at settler colonialism, the narratives that were introduced, and the narratives that continue to fire up people to make it okay to chase us off our land and to kill us and all that kind of stuff. Like, these photos, again, kind of like are just examples of that, right? That, the narratives of, you know, freedom and civilization, this land is just free and ready to grab, and, you know, in the name of progress, in the name of democracy. And, you know, these were some of, like, in this first picture on the left, you see this very angelic, you know, white woman that is laying, if you see in her hand, she's laying down the wires for telephone wires, right? And you see the pioneers and their building, and the loggers, and then over here on the right hand picture, it's nice and light and bright, and then on the left is, you see the tribal people and the buffalo, and it's dark, right? So again, just how pictures like frame things, like one is, you know, light and bright and right, and then the other one isn't. So this all plays a part of colonialism, and seeing one people as superior to the other. And then we go on to look at erasure. So a huge part of colonialism was erasure. And so we've talked about some of the genocidal attempts to get rid of us as a people, and how major that was. And it depends on like who you read or who you research. But some people will say before this country was colonized, there was 100 million Indigenous people on this continent, 100 million. And then today, if anybody knows what our census is, it's like we're like at 5 million, not even 5 million. So over a 100-year period, like 100 million people were wiped off the face of this earth. 100 million. So when we compare that even to like the Jewish Holocaust, which depending again on who you read and research, like between 7 and 11 million Jewish people died in the Jewish Holocaust. No one even calls what happened here the Holocaust. And part of the reason why is because of erasure. So when we could not be erased from the land from genocide, okay, from the massacres and biological warfare and chemical warfare, we were erased in other ways, and we were erased based on federal policy. So there's a whole list of different federal policies that were enacted to get rid of us as a people. And so one of them was back in the 1850s, treaties were signed between tribes and the federal government. And what those treaties did was created reserved land for us, they're called reservations today, right? Where these reserved pockets of land across the nation were reserved for us. And if you look at a map, if you actually Googled a map of, you know, Indian reservations, you'll see that the eastern landscape is very different from the western landscape. And that's because of how good genocide worked on the eastern landscape, right? Those were the tribes of first contact and first European contact. And the genocide worked very well. Like there's tribes that don't exist today because of how well the genocide worked. So as time went on, the federal policy started changing, the reservation system was created, and then pretty soon, like another federal policy was introduced, one of them called relocation, where they took mainly men, but where the federal government would send buses onto reservation communities and round up all the men and then take them into cities with the promise of housing and job training and all of this. And then they were just kind of dumped in these urban areas and received nothing. So this policy was actually like in the 1940s and 50s. So, and I have an uncle that was a part of this, where he got on one of those buses and his bus went to Denver, Colorado, and the bus doors opened and he got off and there was literally nothing. There was nothing, no one there to greet them, no one to give them job training, no one to give them housing. And he spent the next month living on the streets, doing what he could do to get enough money to buy a bus ticket to go back home. And then we have many tribal people living in urban areas today that are still living in poverty because of this relocation policy. So that was another way to erase us, was by throwing us into the Great American Melting Pot. And then we're further erased, as are other people of color, you know, by putting our men, mainly men, into the justice system in prisons. And, you know, you probably all have seen the rates where Native men, Black men, you know, brown men basically are overrepresented in our prison systems, right? And that goes back to all of the stuff that we're talking about, white superiority. And then that even trickles down into our school systems. And that is true in our school systems, where our children are put into detention more often. They're expelled more often. They're taken out of the classrooms and put into, you know, remedial, you know, classes, whether it's for English or whatever. My children were taken out of their classrooms to put into English as a second language class, even though we only speak English in our home. So because my children were brown, they were taken out of their classrooms to be put into English as a second language, to learn English. Of course, until I said something, but like, these are just examples that still happen today, you know, to our people. And then for us, we were further erased, even from our history books. So most Americans, most white Americans in this country don't even know the true history of what happened to the indigenous people in this land. And in part is because of how this country has been socialized to learn about Native people. So the true history was erased from the history books. And so in the, you know, 3rd or 4th grade, whenever it is that people learn about tribal people, they just learn about like Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims, you know, having this nice dinner and, you know, all this kind of stuff. That's what we learn about tribal people. And we learn only from a past historical context. So some people are even surprised that we're still even here on this earth today. So that may sound, you know, hard to believe, but like, it's really true. You know, in fact, just Saturday, we met this lady, my friend, we went to this concert, and this lady was like staring at us. Anyway, we had this conversation with her daughter because her daughter was apologizing, and she had never met a real live Native before. Anyway, it was just this weird thing. So it's just like another example of how we were erased from the history books. And so lots of people, you know, only think of us in terms of a historical context, right? So, and then another example of erasure is erasing us from data forms. And so that has changed a lot. Especially like in the public health arena, for example, or the social service arena. These are finally changing a lot. We were always referred to as an other, right? And people would say, well, your population isn't that significant, or there's not enough of you, or, you know, whatever. So erasure is like huge. And why this is important too, because this trickles down to us as individuals, and our children feel it, right? And then they grow up to adults and they continue to, we're here living in our own original land as if we're not even here. Like, that's big. That's big. So all of these examples that I'm giving are the impacts of colonization, and there's more. We're just like scratching the surface here, right? So we're just trying to talk about the impacts of colonization. So we have to understand colonization before we can better understand decolonization, okay? So those examples that I just gave are some examples of colonization. So basically, taking of the land, taking of our way of life, taking of resources, taking or the attempt to take away of value systems. So let me flick back before we get into decolonization real quick. Another quick example, and I'm trying to give personal examples to show like how powerful this was. So my children's grandfather was taken when he was 5 years old, and he was taken hundreds of miles away and put into boarding school and was not allowed to return until he was 16. So you think about all of his socialization that happened in the boarding school, and then how he felt when he came back to his community. My grandfather, who was born in the early 1900s, he was taken from his parents as well, from present-day Montana, and taken all the way to Pennsylvania. My grandfather went to Carlisle Indian School, right up the road from where Women of Color Network, their offices are. And he actually went to school there with Jim Thorpe. My grandfather went to school with Jim Thorpe, and you can Google Jim Thorpe. He's an amazing Native athlete. So my grandfather made his way back to Montana because he got word that my great-grandmother, that his mother was dying. And so, of course, the school didn't help him get back or anything. He had to make his own way back. If you can imagine, if you look on a map to see where Pennsylvania is and then to see where Montana is, like he made his way back because he wanted to see his mother before she passed away. And he did. He made it there right before she passed away, actually. And then you hear lots and lots of other stories from people about a friend of mine on the Oregon coast. So this was a policy across the nation. Their people were marched from southern Oregon up to the northern part of the state and put on a reservation. And if you married a white man, you didn't have to go on that march. You could stay. But her grandmother didn't marry a white man. Her husband actually passed away, so she had to go on this march, and she was blind. And she missed her homelands and she missed her people so much that she ran away from the reservation, and blind, not once, but twice. Each time to have the Indian agent, so the militarized response to watch over us and guard the reservation to make sure that we don't leave. The Indian agent traveled all these days back down to get this one woman, this elderly woman who was blind, to get her to take her all the way back to the reservation. That trip, I imagine, was probably like 2 weeks to get there and another 2 weeks to get back. And then she did it again. She ran away again because she missed her family so much. That's one example. And there's like literally thousands and thousands, millions of examples like that of how powerful colonization was, right? Again, fueled by that white superiority. So then we get into, see you, Tanya. Take care. So then we get into decolonization. So decolonization is trying to understand and undo some of the damage caused by colonization. So kind of a global picture of that is there's lots and lots of people around the world who are working through the United Nations to really address decolonization. And so you can take a look at this map here that shows us almost a third of the world's population has been impacted by colonization. And what the UN is calling for is basically a reverse on that, right? Of course, the United States did not support this. That's another story. So here's the UN Declaration on Decolonization. I won't read it. You guys can take a look at it. You can Google this and learn more about it, and you can see the countries that supported this and the countries that did not support it. And then this picture is important here because this is, of course, you can read the sign, assert Indigenous people's right to self-determination. And then you can see all the signs in the back, stop mining, stop militarization. So again, that link between protecting the land and the water, so the violence against our earth and how that reflects the violence against our women. So here's a couple of different definitions of decolonization. So again, these are from researchers in the field of American Indian or Indigenous studies. Again, I'm not going to read these. You can read them for yourselves. But some of the researchers there's different levels of decolonization, right? More than likely, total decolonization will never happen because that would mean that every person besides an Indigenous person would have to leave these lands. Right? We would get our land back. That's highly unlikely. But there's other forms of decolonization. I don't know, someone's like some feedback. You guys hear that?
She's talking.
Okay, thank you, that helped. So colonization wasn't or isn't just impacted by the people doing the colonizing. Colonization greatly impacted the Indigenous people of this land so much that there's a whole spectrum. And if you looked at this spectrum, where at one end was somebody who was totally decolonized, meaning they think like their ancestors and they behave like their ancestors, versus somebody at this end of the spectrum who may be very colonized. Even though they're a tribal person, they think like they're colonizers and they behave like they're colonizers. And then there's those of us that are in between on this spectrum. So that's how powerful colonization is, right? And when we internalize this, so we hear these terms like internalized racism or internalized oppression, and those are because of colonization. We have internalized what the colonizers have said about our own selves. We believe that we're less than. I mean, I'm just saying some people believe that. And so colonization was powerful. And I say this because, you know, for 30 plus years working in tribal communities, like I see the impacts of colonization in our people. And it trickles down and it impacts this movement. It impacts the domestic violence movement when we see, you know, tribal women, other women of color, but white women as well, right? White women have been oppressed by the patriarchy, by white men, right? And we can, if we just pause long enough and see where and how that plays out, right? So anyway, here's a couple of definitions to think about decolonization. So there's decolonization and there's decolonizing. So decolonizing is like the action, right? Taking action of how we decolonize. And so here's another definition to look at. So I think one of the interesting things about this definition, it talks about the shared remedial action. So it kind of gets back to some of the questions on the very first slide of this is, you know, what do I stand for, right? And who do I stand with? So when we talk about the shared remedial action, what are we doing together to look at decolonizing? And there, I'll give you a couple more examples. So decolonization. So I talked about that. Due to internalized racism and oppression, many of our own people think like our colonizers. And colonization has been so powerful that we often don't even realize how internalized these ways of thinking are. Decolonization must first start with awareness and then acts of resistance. And when we decolonize, we think more like our ancestors did before colonization. So from an Indigenous perspective, this is what decolonization looks like. From other people's perspectives, you can think about how is your world impacted by colonization, and what can you do to start decolonizing your thinking. And so an example, I'm not sure if Lynn is on here. I thought I saw her name. I don't know if that's Lynn. There's a couple of examples related to this work. So there's a couple of my colleagues that work with the Women of Color Network, or as contractors like myself. And one of the ways that they have looked at decolonizing their workspace is by a shared leadership model. So they have a white woman, a woman of color that are co-directors of their domestic violence organization. So they're looking at decolonizing the way that they do this work. So I think that's really great. And there's other models that people are using to help decolonize their systems. And so so these are just kind of food for thought for you to think about. How is my workspace colonized? What can I do to learn more about that? And then what can I do to start decolonizing that? So it's about a power structure as well. So here's some more to think about. We can decolonize as individuals. We can look at how we're decolonizing as a family, and then as a community, and then as a nation. So again, an Indigenous perspective, for example, some people are decolonizing by taking a look at how other forms of religion have impacted their communities, right? And so people may not celebrate all the Christian holidays that are out there, like Christmas, for example, or Easter as an example. And instead, they may get back to their own spiritual practices before colonization. So they're going to get back to the way their people prayed and the value system that guided that. Or people can start taking a look at their diet and the food that they eat and try to decolonize that. So getting rid of the fast foods and the pops and bringing more of the traditional foods into their diets. So, for example, back at the end of June, we did this, a youth camp. We call it our Native Youth Wellness Warrior Camp. And it's a week-long event. And for that whole week, we're feeding them traditional foods. So they're eating elk and deer and salmon and wild rice and, you know, different nuts and fruit and all this kind of stuff for a week. And for many of the people, it's like a huge shock, right? And for the adults that bring the youth, their chaperones, it's like even a more shock for them. And so we're just trying to introduce these new concepts, right, of how we can decolonize these things. So another way of decolonization from an Indigenous perspective is finding our voice and using it. So, and you see that happening in a lot, especially in different resistant movements around different topics that are happening. And then we can look at decolonizing systems. Again, taking a look at who has the power. Is there social justice and equity happening? And then this another bullet point is really important, and I am going to read this one. So in terms of decolonization, we're not asking settlers to take responsibility for what their ancestors did. We're asking settlers to decolonizing by standing up to the systems that their ancestors put in place and that they continue to benefit from. The systems that contribute to oppression and ongoing racism. So when we talk about, you know, doing this work together, in part, this is what we're talking about. So it's not enough to support social justice from afar, you must take action. So I know I've been talking a lot. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
She might not be there.
So raise your hand if you need to speak.
Does somebody have a question or comment?
Isn't that great?
All right. So this next slide gives some resources and some other examples of how decolonization, like more and more people are learning about decolonization and wanting to learn more. So decolonizing social work. So these are books that are out there, except the photo. So decolonizing social work as an example, decolonizing God. So there's lots of work looking at religion and specifically Christianity, decolonizing the body of Christ, even decolonizing yoga. So there's different attempts out there that are looking at decolonizing spaces and places and policies and things like that. So the next slide is looking at, when we look at decolonization from an Indigenous point of view, it's kind of like this continuum. So we had years of colonization. And then in the 1970s was a great time of change in this country for our people. And this was based on, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years of colonization, the federal policies that impacted our people, how alcoholism impacted our people, all of this stuff. And then the 1970s was a great time of change. And what brought that change in part was the civil rights movement from the 1960s. And what the civil rights movement did was spark this, I guess, this fire inside of our people that said, well, what about our rights? Like we were very empowered and inspired by the civil rights movement. And what it made our people think and take a look at is, well, what about our rights? Like, this is our land. What about our rights? And so the 1970s then was this great time of change, and people that's when the sobriety movement happened in our communities as Indigenous people, and treatment centers popped up, treatment centers for women and children popped up. Like, you know, these were like unheard of things before that. Our people started getting educated in the Western sense, as well as being educated in our own ancestral values, or our own traditional values. So this whole cultural revitalization happened. And that was able to happen because federal policy changed, because before the 1970s, it was like against the law for us to even speak our own language. It was against the law for us to gather and celebrate any part of our culture up until the 1970s. That wasn't that long ago. So the 1970s was this great time of change. And what that change was about was starting to decolonize. So to cleanse our minds and to open our worldview and to really embrace the way our ancestors thought. And then when we took a look at that, then we could start looking at not only how they thought, but the way they behaved and the way they made decisions and the way they did all kinds of things. So from colonization to decolonization, and then the next phase is what we call indigenizing. So once we decolonized, and this is still going, and it will for centuries, but we can start indigenizing. So these are like the phases that we call it. And really what it involves is a healing journey for ourselves, because when we realize like, oh my gosh, I have colonized thinking, like this is a whole journey to start looking at the way we live our lives, right? And starting to let go of some of that and starting to embrace our own ways of thinking. So there's been lots of shame attached to that. And there's lots of shame when people don't know their culture, they don't know their language, or they don't know any part of their culture. There's lots of shame in that. So that's in part what I'm talking about, this healing journey that has to happen. So in terms, again, going back to looking at desecrating the land and the tie to that, and desecrating women, basically what this whole movement is about. There's lots of benefits that the world can gain by embracing more Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And in part, that is coming full circle. Like people are realizing like, oh man, they weren't really savage after all. They really knew what they were talking about in terms of, you know, all different kinds of things. So that's the interesting part. So this is really, oops, sorry. I didn't mean to do that. You'll see my screen. That was the last slide. And there's one slide that I didn't put on there. And I want to read this. I didn't put it on the slide. If anyone's interested, I'll email it to WOCN and they can get it out to people. But there's been lots of work around decolonization. And so I do have a handout from a colleague, Dr. Lynn Gell, her name is, and all of her PhD work was around decolonization. And so she has been ostracized in many arenas and spaces because of her work, because not everyone is ready to learn about decolonization. Not everyone is ready to like embrace their part in colonization, right? Like it's a healing journey on everyone's parts, white people, people of color, tribal people, like it's a healing journey. But anyway, she developed this list. A colonized ally meets a decolonized ally. This is what they learn. And I'm just gonna read these to you. Number one, a colonized ally stands in the front. A decolonized ally stands behind. A colonized ally stands behind an oppressive patriarchy. A decolonized ally stands behind women and children. A colonized ally makes assumptions about the process. A decolonized ally values there may be principles in the process that they are not aware of. A colonized ally wants knowledge now. A decolonized ally values their own relationship to the knowledge. A colonized ally finds an Indigenous token. A decolonized ally is more objective in the process. A colonized ally equates their money and hard work on the land as meaning land ownership. A decolonized ally knows that land ownership is more about social hierarchy and privilege. A colonized ally projects guilt. A decolonized ally knows it's their work to do. A colonized ally projects emotions. A decolonized ally knows Indigenous people have too much to deal with already. A colonized ally has no respect for Indigenous intellectuals. A decolonized ally knows Indigenous people have their own intellectuals. A colonized ally has no idea that they need to decolonize. A decolonized ally understands that they have to continually decolonize. A colonized ally has no idea of the realities of Indigenous oppression. A decolonized ally understands that many layered and intersectional oppression Indigenous people live under. A colonized ally speaks for Indigenous people. A decolonized ally listens. A colonized ally takes on work an Indigenous person can do and is doing. A decolonized ally takes on their work that needs to be done. A colonized ally makes things worse. A decolonized ally understands. A colonized ally says, it's time to get over it. A decolonized ally realizes one's relationship to the harm is subjective. A colonized ally appropriates another nation's Indigenous knowledge. A decolonized ally does the hard work to uncover their own Indigenous knowledge. A colonized ally will loathe this truth that is offered. A decolonized ally will recognize the hard work telling this truth is. So I wanted to end with that. And again, if anyone would like a copy of that, I can send it to WOCN and they can email it out to everyone. Any questions, comments?
You can also type your comments on the chat and then I can read them, or you, Jillian, can open the chat and read and see them directly. We do have some comments from earlier. There was a link shared from Jennifer. She said, this was shared at the training I attended and it provides a significant visual impact of loss of tribal lands. And then it has a link to it. Can everyone see the chat? Just if you go to the bottom of your Zoom app or screen, there is a little symbol, a chat symbol. You could click in there, and there are many comments that you can send to everyone. And then you can also chat privately if you need to request something. But in that case, what are your comments, questions? We still have time. We can spend some time to debrief and answer questions if there are any. Can people be unmuted to ask questions? Sure, I can unmute everyone, but there will be a lot of background noise. You do have the ability to unmute yourself unless you're having trouble. I can unmute you. Do you want to speak, Lynn? Yeah. Okay.
You've got me muted.
I got you muted. I heard you. Can everybody hear me?
You did?
Okay.
That's fantastic.
I'm controlling your voice today, not literally. I am so sorry about that. That didn't.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Jolene, I just had a question about the last thing that you read. Can you repeat the woman's name that put that together?
Oh, Lynn, L-Y-N-N, Gell, G-E-H-L.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, that's okay if there's no questions or comments. This was like just a brief overview about the impacts of colonization and decolonization and re-indigenizing. There's different ways of decolonizing, and when we clean out something, we have to replace it with something else. And so from an Indigenous perspective, what we're doing when we decolonize is re-indigenize by bringing back our ways of thinking, right? Our traditional ways of thinking and doing. And that's how come I say that takes a healing process, because when we have been socialized to believe, you know, in certain things, it's like we have to go through our own journey to understand, you know, how did that happen and why did that happen? And then it takes a whole process of sometimes undoing the brainwashing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this was just like scratching the surface.
Alexis, can you give me the brown paper towel? I was like, I finished opening this, and then a few came out some more. Yeah. I think they hella like overdid it. Yeah.
See, this is what happens when I unmute everyone. We start listening to other side conversations. So. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jillian. I did want to make a personal contribution and comment as you were going through the webinar, which, by the way, was extremely informative, and I learned a lot. So I am I was applying everything you were saying to our situation, to the situation of the Latino, the immigrants, that even at times when we're aware that we have a colonized mind, we have to play it. We have to play the part to survive. I have this conversation with my kids all the time. You can't be as vocal. You can't be as open in certain situations, because it's going to put you in danger. And so it's applicable to other communities as well. So I'm sure that, I mean, it also shows that there's a lot of work that we all need to do at every level. Yeah. So there's no question about it. You know, at the personal, at the yeah. community, at every level, there's so much, and there's so much, but at the same time, it shouldn't feel overwhelming, or we shouldn't have that despair feeling, because there's always something that we can do, something every day, every hour, every life. There's always something, and as small as it may look or sound, it's going to take us, you know, it's doing something.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. You know, another example I was thinking of yesterday when I was getting ready for today was, about a year ago, we were working with this project to train these community health workers. And we were using this certain curriculum that was written by a white woman who had spent a month and had built really good relationships with some women from El Salvador. And so in her curriculum then, she has Spanish language interpretations and Spanish words that are in there, and things like that. And so we were doing this training all for tribal women and using her curriculum. And so we were reading through her curriculum, and we're just like, anyway, we had a conversation with her about the Spanish language part. And it's just like, you know, I speak my colonizer's language every day, and I don't speak my own language fluently because of the impacts of colonization. And now you want me to speak another colonizer's language, like that's not going to happen. We're not going to do that. Spain colonized those countries, and that's why they speak Spanish, you know. Anyway, this was like this whole new concept to her. She did not realize that, right? And she was like very proud of herself because she could speak this other, language, right? Without even realizing it was another colonizer's language. That those people couldn't even speak their own language because of colonization. And so she resisted that at first, and she resisted it so much that we had to go on further and ask her to leave the whole process and have her colleagues come in and work with us, because she was just hanging on to that, still the colonizer, right? So it was just interesting. So once we learn about these concepts, these are big concepts, and if we're just learning about it, we just need to sit with it sometimes. Yes. And really see how does colonization play out? And how am I a part of that? And more importantly, what am I going to do about that now, right?
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah.
It is profound. It takes a lot more than one webinar for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that we that you all have for Jillian? You can unmute, everyone, if someone has a question, you can go to the bottom of the Zoom app and unmute yourself. You do have that capability. I had to mute everyone because there's a lot of background noise, but if anyone has a question that needs to ask, go ahead and do so, or a comment, or a thank you, anything. Sounds like everyone is absorbing all the information. And so I want to thank you, Jillian, for doing the first webinar of the Collective Liberation and Collective Empowerment webinar series, because this is the first one of others. You will all receive information about upcoming webinars. The next one is scheduled for August 8th. It's going to be focused on working with LGBTQ individuals. And then we also have one under the topic of immigration, and some others that you will be hearing about, and some of you already know. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending, but most importantly, I want to thank Jillian for all of this wonderful amount of information and wisdom, and just, planting the seed of something that is so important that we all need to get on board. Let's see, this is comments are, this was great. Comment from Kim is sitting with the perspective shift. On the Spanish inclusion, it's I think that one was a great ending, because you give us some food for thought. I also I personally don't know any of my language, and the region where I'm from, there's an indigenous population, the Tarahumaras, and they're so exploited and so put down, and so I don't know the language of my ancestors, and Spanish is my survival language. Colonized mind. I understand that I live those that every day. So thank you for this, says Jackie, and just a lot of thank yous and gratefulness from people for you and for this time together.
Yeah, you're welcome. And like I said, this is just scratching the surface, right? And so lots of things have been dropped here, and just sit with it for a while and reach out as you feel comfortable and start learning more. You can see how the patriarchy plays out in this country. Like, I look at that everywhere. When I went to the concert, my friend and I went to this concert on Saturday, and we were walking to our seats, and we're like, okay, let's see how many people of color that we see at this concert, right? So like I do that a lot, especially in airports, when I get on the airplane, when I go to the movies, like wherever I go, besides my own tribal community, which is mainly my tribal members. When I go other places, I see how the patriarchy plays out. So we can do our own social experiments about trying to expand our worldview by seeing how our worldview plays out around us. And then we can bring it in smaller. How does it impact our families? How does it impact our places of work? What are small things that I can start doing to decolonize my mind, so then our behaviors are decolonized? So this is just scratching the surface today. And, again, I thank everyone for listening and encourage you to continue to learn.
Thank you. Thanks again. So have a great rest of your Monday. I know that it's some of you are from the East Coast, so it's already almost the end of your Monday. So I hope it was a good one. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention and your time. And you'll have a great one.
Okay.
Bye,
Bye.
Jean.
Thank you all very much. Take good care.
Thank you, Jamila.
Say hi, Jillian. Oh, she's gone.
You're not Samaya. I know that much.
I thought I would catch Jillian because I wasn't sure if she.
Oh no.
I just wanted to say hi to her.
Yeah.
She's gone.
Okay. Thank
Have a good rest of the day.
you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.